Welcome back to another episode of Afghan Beyond Conflict. This series will be running throughout the month of February on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 6 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, where we will delve into the evolution of Afghan identity with our esteemed guests. To receive notifications and updates regarding the series, please follow our social media platforms. And if you miss any of our episodes, please check them out on our YouTube channel. Today, we will be in conversation with Professor Nazif Shahrani. Professor Shahrani was born, raised, and partly educated in Afghanistan. He is currently Professor of Anthropology, Central Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. He has conducted extensive ethnographic field research in Afghanistan and studied Afghan refugees communities in Pakistan and Turkey. Since the ouster of Taliban from power, he has regularly visited Afghanistan, publishing widely. His most recent books include Revolutions and Rebellions in Afghanistan, Anthropological Approaches, and Modern Afghanistan, The Impact of 40 Years of War. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And thank you very much, Ms. Khanum, for inviting me to be part of this interesting program you have. And I'm at your service.
It's our honor. Professor, as customary with this series, the first question that I would like to ask you is, what does it mean to you to be an Afghan?
Well, as you know, identities are all not substantive. You cannot tell them an Afghan means this. Its identities are all relational. That is, when you are in contact or in discourse with someone else, that's when the nature of identity comes into existence. And also, identity is a kind of a cultural tool that people make use of it either for emotional purposes, for affective purposes, or they make instrumental uses of it. When it's convenient to be somebody, then people say, and this, that, so forth. Let me just tell you a little bit about my sort of identity, or part of this complex of things that I am. One of them is Afghan. So I'm not Afghan all the time, because there are a couple of things that I need to say also about identities. That is, identities have two components. One is you're born with. So you sort of inherit. You have no choice. It's there. The other ones are acquired. That you become choose a profession. You become a professional, a teacher, professor, a physician, whatever the case may be. So national identity in the modern period is something, I suppose one could say, you're born in. Mm-hmm. But you can also give it up. You can also acquire another one. People like me who are binational.
Right.
We have two nationalities, as it were. So one of them I have acquired voluntarily. I wasn't born in the United States, but I was forced by circumstances when Afghanistan was not there for me to be had, that I needed to have another, passport. These are all new modern phenomena, as you know. When I first came to the United States at the age of maybe around 22 or so, I was junior in college in Kabul University. In America, Afghan meant two things. One was a blanket, a particular kind of, netted blankets that they here in the market, they called it Afghan. The other one is a hound, a dog. Afghan, these are very long-legged sort of hunting dogs.
Right.
So, that's when Americans heard of Afghan, they probably thought one of those two things. And then they looked at me and I wasn't looking like neither one of them.
Right.
So it's a question of, I think, where you are. Afghan to me is a sort of imposed identity that we really had very little to do with its even formation. The country was essentially put together by outsiders. Its entire map, its entire borders, not an inch of that was determined by Afghans or by people who lived in this country. It was all negotiated between the Tsarist Russians and British India. Every inch of it. The northern borders of Afghanistan was entirely negotiated between Russia and they demarcated. They have, all the signed papers and so forth. The western part was negotiated between Iran and British India, and the eastern part and southern part, the Durand line, that was carved out by the British themselves. And the little 70 kilometers or so that's common with China in that panhandle, that was not even put on paper on formal basis until 1960s. So, an accident of birth is that I was born in a village in northeastern part of this country. And being Afghan meant nothing really. Afghan, in fact, when I was born and raised in this village in northeastern Afghanistan, as I was growing up, meant Pashtuns. I never thought myself as an Afghan. We were Uzbeks or Tajiks in the area. And when they talked about Afghans, it meant the Pashtun who came into the area, who were dominant political, representatives of those who were ruling the country. So my notion of being an Afghan really did not happen until I came to Kabul to attend middle school, high school, and a couple of years of college. And there we were told that we are Afghans. So the way I think my Afghanness inside Afghanistan is really virtually non-existent, because inside the country it's not relevant, because you don't relate to anyone else where being Afghan is important. Okay, there you're in Uzbek versus, in my case, versus perhaps a Tajik or a Hazara or a Baluch or a Pashtun. Or our other identities, from which province, from which part, and those kinds of things. So really, Afghan becomes significant or important or relevant once you've left the country, or when you're dealing with people who are not part of the community as such. And how we use that is, again, either effective or instrumental. Okay, it's our part of our cultural toolkit, essentially. How we make use of it when it is convenient, when we want to feel good and feel, in the early years I was in the United States, and I still seeing an Afghan makes me, or someone from Afghanistan, not an Afghan, someone from Afghanistan makes me really feel good, excited. I want to know who they are, where they are, what, all that sort of stuff. And when people talk to me, in the earlier years, I jokingly would say, I'm an Afghan, but not a blanket or a hound. So just to create a sort of break. And a lot of people then didn't even know where Afghanistan was. Now, of course, more than 1 million Americans have served in the country as soldiers alone, fighting in the last 20 years. And probably half as much or as many have gone through as civilians into the country. So that you run into, in my classroom, I have students who have served in Afghanistan in the military, or others who have been there for some. So, the whole thing has changed, but also it has the implication of, a country at war, a country, suffering, a country misruled, corruption, all of those things are part and parcel of sort of the notion of Afghan, unfortunately, these days. So that's the sort of my overall take on what Afghan means. And it's, again, something that someone else named that place. Someone else defined the place. And they chose to use the name of one of the many groups of people who lived in that territory, and that was the Pashtuns. Because the British Indians were in contact with them for a very long time, so they knew them, and they were also in the Afghan wars. They perhaps confronted each other in battlefields, and they dealt with their khans and their rulers and so forth. They had their own very close connections, which eventually ended up being crystallized in the name of the country. And that's, I'm sure others have also brought this up, it is a contentious identity in Afghanistan today. There is this insistence that everybody should call themselves Afghans, but within Afghanistan's context, others are saying that we're not. We are Tajiks, we are Heratis, we are Turkestanis, we are Badakhshanis, we are Nuristanis. So there are all of these other things, and that it is a name of a particular group imposed on the rest, and that is creating some kind of a tension within the society. And I'm sure you're aware, it has come up that there is this insistence on the new identity card that government is issuing, that everybody should be everybody's nationality should be referred to as Afghan. And people are saying, no, I should be, it's identity card of Afghanistan's people. It says Islamic Republic of Afghanistan on the top. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to nationality, I should be an Uzbek who lives in Afghanistan, a Tajik who lives in Afghanistan, or a Pashtun who lives in Afghanistan, instead of everybody being homogenized into this one name, Afghan.
Now, I mean, there's quite a few questions actually I have regarding what you've just said. Now, the first one I think would be, like you've mentioned, Afghan, okay, granted, I guess pre-1960s, before we had sort of semi-solidified borders at least, and, back then, okay, if, Afghans and Pashtuns were synonymous of each other. And then Still are, but I mean, I would say that a lot of people have also, these are the Afghans that I've come across in the diaspora, at least, right? Mm-hmm. So whether, when you ask someone where they're from, right, like you said, first is Afghan, then it's the ethnic identity, and this might be prevalent in the diaspora. I'm not so sure about Afghans in Afghanistan. But would you not?
I can assure you, inside Afghanistan, it's not that way. It's so the structure of dyadic relationships are somewhat different, and being Afghan is not that critical.
So how would you
assume to be?
Now, a question that comes to my mind when I think about that is that it prevents sort of a unification within the country. If the ethnic identity is prioritized, how is there any form of reconciliation then, or any sort of way, just so, because it obviously brings up contention, like you said, it's a contentious identity. How do we overcome that contention, because it's what ultimately is leading to the conflict and the issues that are taking place within the government and the society itself?
You see, the problem is not the name itself,
right?
It's how that name is being used in one of those two ways, effective fashion or instrumental fashion, right? What happens is that in Afghanistan, those who are members of the Afghan or Pashtun community are considering themselves to have privileges that they don't want to be extended to others. There is this rank order in society that was created back in the 1880s, after 1880 to 1901, and then it continued, where basically even within Pashtun society, they had ranked those who were members of the royal family or sardars, and then you had people below them in some kind of rank order, and how much they drew from government treasury, and what privileges they had in terms of access to land and water, and goes on and on. And then others were excluded from those. Some of these folks didn't have to pay taxes, didn't have to serve in the military, but they could be officers, but not rank and file. And rank and file had to be from other communities. So it's this kind of discriminatory practices that brings about disunity and tension and violence in society, not the fact that people are referred to as this or that. You remember in the Quran, it's very clear that Allah creates these differences of tribes and people and so forth for what? To know each other. And the best of you are the ones who are the muttaqi, the ones who behave their best, right? Mm. So in practice, what happens is that we don't follow that. It's not for the purpose of knowing each other. It's for the purpose of how can you instrumentally make use of your identity to get access to more strategic resources. So I know people who are not Pashtun, but they adopt in writing a Pashtun last name, adding a Zai. Their name might be Murad. They'll instead of calling themselves Murad, they say Murad Zai or Pupal Zai or things of that sort. Why? Because the assumption is that if your name can be identified with a group that claims privileges, maybe you will be given that privilege, or at least you will not be denied something that you think is a member of the society as a whole you deserve and you should have. So really, it's not the question of name is such. When the names are being used as the basis, or identities are being used as a basis for discriminatory dealing with each other, that's the source of disunity. Afghanistan's not having a national sense of, togetherness is not a product of, there are different people living there. In America, more different people are living. And this is probably the most, where I am in the last 50 years, I've almost lived here. This is far more diverse than Afghanistan would ever become. Virtually every ethnic group from Afghanistan has a member or members in the United States, plus, of course, the rest of the world. So here we're all Americans. Nobody is objecting to being an American. And being an American means that you're claiming equality with the rest of this society. We're all immigrants, we live here, and we're all Americans, and we are also subject to the same rules, the same constitution, the same laws, the same everything. But in places like Afghanistan, that it is never so. And if you are Afghan or a Pashtun, then you have privileged position. For example, they have been consistently insisting that the head of the state should be one of them. You know the story of the Bonn agreement, where
you could tell, like, summarize.
Well, let me tell you what the story was. Okay, I've heard it from the mouth of people who were involved there. When the gathering at Bonn happened, there had been some kind of informal division of which group. There were 4 groups represented. And they each, of course, claimed to represent certain portions of the country. One was the Northern Alliance. They had the larger share of the representatives in Bonn. They had apparently decided that they can't or they don't want to be the head of state. They just wanted key ministries like defense, interior, economy, and so on and so forth. And then there was the group referred to as the Rome group, which belonged to the king, the former king, King Zahir Shah, his representatives. And there were 14 of those. And apparently they had assigned that the king or the king's group representatives should be introducing the head of state from amongst themselves. And then there was a Peshawar group, which was really sort of Pashtun tribes from the east who had been left out, and Pakistanis essentially were maybe pushing them into the front, that they should be included. And then there was the Cyprus group, which was Iranian-backed. This whole sort of proxy war and proxy politics that was going on. So the story is, when the group of representing the king and the Rome group were asked to introduce one of themselves as head of state, the person who was heading that group was chairman of basically their 14 members, in which Karzai was a member. He asks Dr. Abdulsattar Sirat, who lives here in the United States now. Sirat asks the king's grandson, Mustafa, who is with him, to please go and call your grandfather in Rome and get some instruction as to whether he wants to be the head of state or whether he wants some other way we should introduce somebody. So Mustafa goes and talks to grandfather, and grandfather comes and tells him, he said he was not interested in being head of state himself, and that since the country was beginning a new democratic future, maybe the best thing would be to do this democratically. That is, you 14 people elect one of your own to be introduced as head of state. And who is introduced? Who is elected? 12 people give their vote to Sattar Sirat. And only 1 or 2%, including, of course, Hamid Karzai, to himself, because he had been already chosen by the United States, by CIA and everybody else, that this was their man, and they wanted him. And Khalilzad objects because of what? What is wrong with Sattar Sirat? He is not a Pashtun. He is an Uzbek who had spent all of his life serving the monarchy. He had, in fact, changed his own Uzbek name, not to sound like an Uzbek. His name allegedly was Sattar Qul, and his father's name may have been Jabbar Qul, and that he had dropped the Qul part and added Abdul Sattar and Abdul Jabbar, so that people could not see that he is in Uzbek. But despite him having won 12 votes to be this head of the interim government, it was not acceptable to the Pashtuns. And Khalilzad and Karzai and Ahmadzai and all of them essentially said, no, you're not acceptable because you're not Pashtun. So this is the reality of Afghanistan, that no one else can have the privilege of heading that state, although we have had a couple of, Burhanuddin Rabbani was for a while, it was a Tajik. And that was not acceptable, and they fought against him. The entire time he was president, there was war against him by Hikmatyar for many years, and then after that by Taliban. And the only other instance in the history, in the last 140 years history of Afghanistan, was the 1929, when another Tajik ruler from Kudaman, Habibullah Kalakani, was a ruler for 9 months, and that's it. So this is the total of our history. And those who are now in the ruling clique in Afghanistan are still claiming that they are the privileged one to rule the country, and they must enjoy this certain privileges. And the rest of the country are essentially in disbelief that in this day and age, in 21st century, our leadership would be insisting that their tribe, their ethnic group, their particular thing should have certain privileges that should be denied to the rest of the society. In America, in practice it may be, but in reality it hasn't been. We have had even a Black or African American president here. And we have had also, Donald Trump. But in Afghanistan, the problem, I think, is not, when they talk about national unity can be earned, can be constructed when there is sense of equality and access to all privileges and all resources on the same level without reference to anybody's identity. But that's what Afghanistan has lacked, and that's what government systems in Afghanistan have basically resisted to create law and order and allow equality of everybody. So it's not because we're diverse, it's because we're treated differentially that is preventing us from becoming a nation like America.
And it's an interesting point. I mean, it's obviously it's something that has brought a lot of contention, and it is, it's very difficult to, I appreciate you saying that. Basically, it's, because we've had both sides of the story so far, if that makes sense. Are providing another side of the story, so it's interesting to gain that insight. And especially from your perspective as an anthropologist, right, and which is your speciality, and you have worked in Afghanistan. As we said in your introduction, you've been back and forth. And and I've noticed when I was reading that you've conducted extensive research on a particular group of people in the northern northern parts, northeastern of Afghanistan. Could you comment on their role and what interesting findings that you must have found? And there's a term that actually the first time I came across was a native anthropologist. And can you tell me about your experiences as a native anthropologist, and what that means, and how has that helped you with your research?
Good of you to ask that. In fact, yesterday I spent an hour and a half to participating or visiting a graduate seminar in anthropological methods here at Indiana University. My colleague was teaching the course. I have a very long article on published back in 1996, I think. It is on how I became native anthropologist.
Right.
And it has a very challenging sort of theme about it, because until about 1980s, anthropology, as you know, is a colonial subject.
Right.
It was created by colonialist powers, a science essentially, to learn about people that they were under their control, that they wanted to govern them better. They wanted to control them better with the least cost. So social anthropology was in the service of British India. And then French had their own, and Italians and all of them. Anyway, so this is the nature of things. And it was defined as the study of others by the white man, by the white European and American people going and studying others. So when others begin to, after in the 1960s and 1970s, independence and all the rest, that they get into academia, they begin to study this field of social sciences. So what happens is that you are now you are the other, but the other who is coming and learning the science of this. And now you are in a sort of ambiguous situation. Are you a native informant, or you are an anthropologist? And this is where the thing is, that my argument has been that my being from Afghanistan, and there are now hundreds of us, thousands of us actually, in the field. Anthropology is a very large field in the United States. Our association has more than 10,000 members. And I'm sure a whole bunch of them are people like me who have come from the former colonies and former this and that. So that we're sort of arguing in the late 1980s, when people, this development of modernism and postmodernism, and what is the role of people like us who go into other communities and spend a long time and learn their language and do this, or the white man used to do that anyway. and they bring and write about them, and they pretend that they're objective. They are what they say is the truth, is they observed in this road. But by 1980s, people were questioning this assumption that there is any objectivity in people who go to other places and learn the language half-baked and all the rest. And what about people who actually learn the science, but also know the language and also have insights into their own cultures that outsiders can never, acquire? And the whole argument of anthropology was, or anthropologists, white Western anthropologists who went, was that they became natives. They came to see the perspective of the natives, and they were speaking for them. So now you have these people who are actually from there, who have also acquired the same skills that they have, but they also go and produce knowledge about themselves. And my challenge has been not where I studied, that is where I did research. My challenge was where I studied anthropology and where I'm working as an anthropologist. That here I have been continuously treated as the other, despite my skills, knowledge, and so forth. I'm still being sort of treated as other. So there are two fields, in other words. Field of research, the place where people do research. There I was the honored guest. While the white man who went there, they were the marginal man. They were considered marginal natives. So it's a reversal. I go there and treated as an honored guest. I collect the information, I write, I come and talk and teach. And when I'm here in the classroom or outside with my colleagues, I'm treated still as a marginal person, because I'm not like one of them. I'm not like them. So that's the challenge of being native. I think native anthropologists, native scholars, native sociologists, that means people from our part of the world who have essentially gone through the academy of European universities or American universities. They have gotten the credentials. They write authoritatively about their own societies. They complement. I think it's a complementary task. I don't think it should be just one or the other. But the important thing is that we have to realize the complementarity of our contribution to knowledge and understanding and unpacking the complexity of human social life. Why are we so different in different places? How did we change? How did we get where we are? These are the sort of key questions that anthropologists have been grappling with. And I think people like me who are from another part of the world have something to say. That is, they can speak on behalf of their own people just as authoritatively, or in some instances even more authoritatively than a white man or a white woman who has gone and done the same thing in those areas. So that's the sense in which I'm referring to as the native anthropologist. That we have very, very, very competent people. I don't know if you have heard of Talal Asad.
Yes.
Talal is the son of Asad, who did the tafsir of Quran. And his mother is from Saudi Arabia, but his father was a German journalist who converted to Islam, and Muhammad Asad, who even had a role in representing Pakistan in its earliest formation. So we have lots of famous, actually, anthropologists who are from the Muslim world as well as Indians. I mean, we have lots of Indian scholars who are first rate, and those are native anthropologists. There was a lot of literature produced. My article was one of the small things that I got done in the 1990s, sort of reflecting on my experience with the Kyrgyz. This group of Kyrgyz that I studied in the Northeast, in the Panhandle, sort of points towards China.
Right.
This is an area of where people lived above 14,000 feet altitude. It's the top of the mountains. It's called roof of the world. I spent about 21 months doing research there in 1972 to 74. And of course, there are people who are Turkic speaking, they're Sunnis, and they were neighbors of the Wahi, who also occupy northern parts of Pakistan, Gilgit, Chatral, these areas, and then across Afghanistan and across the river in Tajikistan. So I studied both the Wahi and the Kyrgyz because they were intimately connected with one another in terms of their economics, particularly. One was agricultural, one was herding, and so forth. So I have a book, and there's a documentary and a whole bunch of articles about them. But they were the first of the Afghanistani population who left the country as a whole, as a group, and became refugees in northern Pakistan. They lived, the Kyrgyz did.
Right, okay.
And I went there actually 1 year after they left. The communist coup happened in April,
right,
1978. They left in July, August, the country. So very early.
What were the specifics, if you don't mind me asking, of triggering that migration?
The reason was they had been running from communism.
Right, okay.
So their ancestors had run away from Ush region in modern-day Kyrgyzstan when Bolshevik revolution happened.
Right.
Okay, so they had come to this area was their summer pastures.
Oh, okay.
This area of Pamir was where they sort of came during the summer, spent the summer, and then went back in the fall to lower altitudes, warmer climes, and so forth. But once the Bolshevik revolution happened, they came and took refuge in this Afghan two valleys, Little Pamir and the Great Pamir Valley. And then they had another encounter with Russians during the World War II. Actually, they were being aggressive. They thought the Russians were busy in the war in the West. Now they were going to do something and go maybe, breach the borders and go and get something from them. So they had retaliated, and then they run over to China, the Chinese territory. So they lived there for a few years until Mao came. So China took over that area and became communist. So they run back into Afghanistan. By this time, the Kabul regime was willing to claim them and provide some kind of protection for them until 1978. So when the third communist encounter happened, they knew. In fact, the Khan, the chief of Kyrgyz, sent one of his sons, his oldest son, to Badakhshan, to Faizabad, go check out, see what they are. He came back and said this was a communist coup. And the father essentially decided that this is time for him to leave. So he tells his people, you stay, I'm in danger, I want to go. And the people say, if you go, we go. So the whole lot of them then go into Gilgit, Honze area. And I got there, I think, 1 year after they had been already there. And I found them in disarray, essentially. Nobody had, they were suspected by ISI, by government, by everybody, because they don't look like the Afghans they knew. Afghans they knew were all Pashtuns.
Right.
And all of a sudden, this group of people whose language is different, they look very different, they're Asiatic and so forth. So they're suspicious. Who has sent them? And for a year, they did nothing for them. So they essentially sold all of their herds and fed themselves in that situation. So when I was there, I wrote a report about who they are, what they are. I took it to UNHCR in Islamabad. Fortunately, UNHCR then went and created a camp for them. They lived for another 3 years there, and then they were able to be relocated in eastern Turkey. And in fact, just a few hours, it was at 10 o'clock our time, I was on a Zoom meeting with 51 of them in Turkey. So they're thriving in Turkey. They have never had school. They never had any privileges, any resources. In Turkey, they have been given plenty of land. A whole new village was built for them. And within 1 year, every adult was actually literate, man and woman. in Turkey, in modern Turkish, because their language is close enough. So they adopted Turkish quickly, and now they have professors, they have surgeons, you name it, everybody. I don't know, at least maybe 10 PhDs from amongst the younger generation who are in Turkey. So that's that also shows the human potential that we are losing by not serving their needs. When they have opportunity, they glow. And Kyrgyz certainly have shown that so much talent from amongst them had been lost all these years doing nothing but shepherding on top of this God forbidden mountain.
And it would be due to the governments failing to provide for their needs and allowing them to integrate into
absolutely, absolutely. Who else? I mean, in modern era, governments traditionally, historically, in our part of the world,
right,
were not essentially responsible for anything other than control and other than extraction. They were taking things from people and keeping them in check. That was it. But since World War II and the rise of so-called modern nation states, the governments now have responsibilities as well as the rights. And part of that responsibility was to provide healthcare, provide education, provide communication and infrastructure. And so nothing was done for these people. Nothing. In fact, they couldn't even send government officials in the area. They were given the task of protecting Afghanistan's border against Soviet Union in the area that there was contact. You couldn't find a single government soldier in there. Yet that area was protected, and also against China. Pakistan was less of an issue because the mountain ridges are very, very high. It's impenetrable to some extent, with the exception of a couple of spots from which they can, make some kind of access either to the Pamir or to Pakistani side. But the Chinese side was part of the Silk Route. This is a Waqjir Pass. It's 16,000 something feet high, and people went through a great deal. The Russian side the Soviet side was actually just wide open. You could just go. So they were left there. Come on, no schools, no clinics, nothing, no road. When I was doing my research, I had to take trucks to Khandud or Qalai Panja. The most, in fact, I never went to Qalai Panja by vehicle. And then I had to rent horses and get on horseback and travel for another 5-6 days to get to the point where I did my fieldwork and research.
Are there other refugee groups that you might have studied in Pakistan as well?
Well, I spent a lot of time actually in the 1980s in Pakistan, and refugee camps in Chatral, refugee camps around Peshawar, Kuhat, even Baluchistan, because I was studying the Mujahideen resistance issues. And so that the way to do that was to do it through these refugee camps. I even served 6 months actually in 1989 as advisor to the late President Rabbani, as his what do you call them, counselor, aid of sorts in how to manage this aid. International assistance, because there are all kinds of things being done and there was no coordination. I helped them actually create a coordinating body, which then became another NGO, unfortunately. And so, yes, I was involved with resistance, both resistance. Most of my publication, including the book that you referred to, the Revolutions and Rebellions, which is an edited volume of anthropologists at the time when they had studied Afghanistan, is about resistance and the jihad and its consequences, both in the 1990s and then since the American intervention.
Could you tell us of some notable points from that, from those findings, like your time during that time, especially with the Mujahideen and resistance that was taking place?
I think the highlights that one can
Yeah.
sort of mention is that the Islamic resistance movement in Afghanistan was a popular movement. It's an indigenous movement. It started from ground up. People who knew about earlier Soviet atrocities in Central Asia. You remember, Central Asia had about 500,000 refugees, Uzbeks and Tajiks primarily, who had crossed the Oxus River into northern Afghanistan. And that in the 1920s, during Aman Allah's period, they were waging jihad from Afghan side against the Soviet Union. But Aman Allah did not allow them to do that, except for the first year, 2 years, 1921, 22. By 22, the Soviets had basically put pressure on him, and he had brought the Emir of Bukhara and imprisoned him, really house arrest, in a fort outside of Kabul. And then during that 9 months of civil war, when Kalakani was the ruler of Afghanistan, they were encouraged to wage jihad against the Russians. And they started. And then when Nader Khan came, they overthrew. Nader Khan came. Nader Khan was responsible for defeating the Islamic resistance of Central Asian people. He sent essentially Pashtuns from the northwest frontier area into the north. And Russians give them weapons, give them money, and the British had done too. And they put a price on the head of Muslim jihadi fighters in northern Afghanistan. And there's documentation on that anybody who delivered a skull, the head of a human being with less facial hair, because the Uzbeks and some Tajiks are considered to be with less beard, that they give them cash money. And they drove the Muslim Mujahideen across the river. Russians took them and slaughtered them. Ibrahim Bey Laqai, one of their jihadi leaders, was hanged in 1931 in Tashkent because Afghan government drove these Muslim Turks, Uzbeks and Tajiks across the river. Now, if somebody could imagine that, if Pakistanis had done that to the Afghans in the 1980s, what would have happened? The Afghan jihad would have no possibility of success against the Russians. None. So the defeat of Mujahideen of Central Asia fighting against Bolsheviks in northern Afghanistan was in the hands of the Afghan government. They defeated them, they killed them, they drove them back. So just coming back to the 1980s, in the beginning of what Afghan jihad was, that it was indigenous, and that they had a refuge in Pakistan. And thank God. And Pakistanis did enormous service to the people of Afghanistan by allowing them a place of refuge. Nobody drove them out. Nobody was hostile to them. They welcomed them. They did all kinds of wonderful things. But what happened in the process was that indigenous movement was essentially appropriated by outsiders to their own benefit. Americans came in, and Pakistan's Ziaul-Haq, of course, during his own reign, to promote his own misrule in Pakistan, took advantage of that. Eventually, the resistance that was truly popular became a tool, an instrument. It turned into a tool or an instrument of Cold War. And then we kept losing. So they did not allow a single coordinated resistance movement. Instead, they divided it into 7 groups. And they would not allow, for example, Uzbeks to have any kind of organization in Pakistan. They also only allowed one Tajik organization, the Jamiat, and 6 of them were all Pashtun-dominated or Pashtun organizations. So these are the divisions that came to be created by Pakistan, in particular, ISI, but also it was supported by America in the West, that they funded it. So and at the end, as you know, in Geneva Accords, Mujahideen were denied even their presence in the negotiation. Pakistanis negotiated for them with Americans, and then the Kabul regime with Soviets. And so, the rest, you can see that this had a very, very negative impact in creating a sense of division, disunity, lack of a sense of nationhood. A lot of wars generally are said to be creating nations, but in Afghanistan it destroyed instead of building, because this was a war that was completely funded and directed and run by outsiders, not by Afghans themselves. So Afghans were basically the instruments of killing each other, not producers of means of resistance. They didn't make a single bullet. And everything was given to them, and they consume it. They were consumers of war, not in fact doing much of anything. And the consequences of all of that has continued after the Soviets were defeated, and defeated not by us. We had a role to play, but in fact it was Western Americans and Saudis who built in the tune of $10 billion, the war effort, which drove the Soviets out. And then the outcome was another disaster. They succeeded militarily, but failed politically miserably. And Taliban came, and since then, the rest of the story.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that insight. We've covered so many broad topics, and this is usually the time in the series where we basically give the mic to yourself and, make any concluding remarks that you would like to on the broad topic that we have in our hands today. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, all I want to say is, since the topic was identity of the meaning of Afghan, identities, generally speaking, are just a means of creating meaning, really. Language is nothing but creation of meaning. You remember the story in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates Adam and asks, the Malaik that he's going to create this new creation, and they're saying, no, we are doing all of your bidding. Why? He's going to, shed blood and do this and do that. So Allah says, I know things you don't know. And what is that things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows and they don't? Gives Adam the potential for being able to name things. Allah teaches them names of things, which really means Allah, to the first human beings who came to have consciousness, who came to have the ability to choose between this or that, right or wrong. So it comes through language. Okay, language is the means. Language is the first thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala endows human beings with to distinguish them from all the rest of the creature. So that's the beginning of identity, that things come to have identity of their own. The tree becomes tree in English language, and maybe darakht in Persian, and shajara in Arabic, and so forth, whatever. It's not what specifics, but the whole point. So identity is the beginning of assigning meaning to phenomena around and about us. If that's the case, then why are we abusing it in terms of evaluating each other? It was not about evaluation of ranking, who is better, who has access to more or less. The politicization of identities, which is part and parcel of the institution of modern nation state, a poisonous institution that the West, the colonial powers, came and imposed on the rest of the world. This is the most powerful poison that they have spread. And it's this institution of modern nation state which is the cause of politicization of identities. That by naming a country like Afghanistan after one group, and then making sure that there are a lot of other groups are in there, which has served their purpose all along. But we're the ones who don't realize it, and we suffer because of our ignorance of how this particular idea has been instrumentally used against us to subjugate us, to enslave us, to destroy us, to deny our dignity. And we become part of this miserable game that others have been playing with us for a long time. So my plea with my own countrymen is that we accept our differences, cultural differences, but we should insist on our equality politically. In political terms, we should be all brothers and sisters, Muslims, human beings who deserve to be enjoying the same rights and privileges. But culturally, we should allow the differences that define us is human beings with their own characteristics. So tolerance, not just tolerance, really acceptance and celebration of differences culturally, and insistent on treating each other equally in political terms is what we need for the future if we want to create an Afghanistan that has national identity, that people are proud to be a member of that society, and have nothing to sort of complain about. That's the thing that we have to aspire. And unfortunately, leaders of Afghanistan, particularly from those who have been running the country, and I'm not saying that this is a categorical problem. It's a problem of a very small minority of elite, the power elite, who are always in league with outsiders. They create these rented regimes. They are rented because they get the money and the weapons and everything else, and they use that against their own people, like it happened in the 1880s. And then they abuse their own people. And that's our tragedy. So we need to realize this and try to come up with ways that we can, in fact, heal our society and gain our dignity. This is, dependency is the worst form of loss of one's dignity. And we have become dependent society completely for the last 140 years. And it has gotten worse every year. Today, we're more dependent on America in the international community in Afghanistan than we were 20 years ago. Or 40 years ago, even less dependent we were compared to where we are today. So that's my story for you.
No, that's a very powerful note to end on. I thank you so much, Professor, for your incredible insight on a very broad range of topics, but very useful nonetheless. And I would like to thank our audience for watching. Please join us for another episode this Wednesday at the same time, where we'll be in conversation with award-winning journalist Khojasta Samii. Thank you so much to everybody on behalf of Identity International.
Okay, thank you to you, Misbah, and also to everyone who has spent the time to listen to us either live or will be listening later through recorded sessions.
Definitely.
I appreciate it. It was very nice to be with you.
I'm glad, and likewise, Professor.
Okay.